Hello everyone, I am the boring historian, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. In the dimly lit corridors of medieval justice, there existed men whose names were whispered with dread, whose approach silenced crowded streets, and whose touch few survived unscathed. The medieval torturer, executioner, inquisitor, or simply the pain master, stands as one of history's most reviled yet misunderstood figures. Popular imagination casts them as sadistic monsters who delighted in human suffering, black-hooded demons who served as the physical manifestation of medieval cruelty. Yet the reality, as is often the case with history's most infamous characters, was far more complex. The men who carried out these grim duties rarely chose their profession freely. Instead, they were often trapped in a thankless role by poverty, inheritance, social ostracism, or duty to authority. For many, becoming a torturer was not an expression of sadistic desire, but a desperate grasp at survival in a world that offered few alternatives to those of low birth or tainted lineage. This narrative seeks to uncover the overlooked human dimension of these shadowy historical figures, the psychological burden they carried, the social isolation they endured, and the complex moral universe they inhabited. Far from being mere instruments of cruelty, medieval torturers were themselves victims of a system that demanded terrible deeds in the name of justice, religion, and order. For many torturers in medieval Europe, their grim profession was not a choice but a birthright. Executioner dynasties existed throughout Europe, with the trade passing from father to son across generations, creating families whose names became synonymous with death and suffering. These dynasties included the Sansons of France, who served as royal executioners for over 2 centuries, and the Reichardt family of Bavaria, whose members conducted executions for an astonishing 14 generations. Born into such a family, a son would learn the trade from childhood, watching his father's work and gradually being introduced to the tools and techniques of torture and execution. This inheritance was as much a curse as a profession. These children were born already outcast, their future predetermined by their father's occupation. Franz Schmidt, executioner of Nuremberg from 1578 to 1617, wrote in his journals of being forced into the profession by his father, who had himself been compelled to become an executioner after being falsely accused of a crime. Schmidt described his initial horror at the work and his lifelong ambition to escape the profession, a dream he ultimately fulfilled when, after decades of loyal service, he was granted the right to become a citizen and practice medicine. Not all torturers inherited their position. Many were coerced into service through various means. Convicted criminals were sometimes offered commutation of their own sentences if they would serve as executioners. The psychological calculation was simple but devastating. Become the instrument of others' suffering, or face that suffering yourself. In medieval England and France, authorities sometimes conscripted men from the lowest rungs of society, particularly those with physical strength but few other marketable skills. Other torturers were former soldiers, men already accustomed to violence, who could no longer serve in armies due to age or injury. In Spain during the Inquisition, many who served as torturers were themselves conversos, Jews or Muslims who had converted to Christianity, and who sought to prove their devotion to their new faith by participating in the persecution of others. Their position was doubly precarious, suspected for their origins and despised for their current occupation. Perhaps the most common path into the torturer's profession was simple economic necessity. In a world of limited opportunity, where starvation was a constant threat for the lower classes, the role of torturer offered something rare: steady employment with guaranteed payment. Executioners were typically paid per execution or torture session, with rates varying according to the complexity and duration of the procedure. Records from 15th century Germany show that an executioner might receive 5 gulden for a beheading, but significantly more for breaking a man on the wheel or performing a complex torture session designed to extract a confession. Many executioners supplemented their income by selling items associated with their work. Pieces of the rope used in hangings were believed to have magical properties and could fetch high prices. In some regions, executioners were granted the right to claim the clothing of their victims, which they would then sell. Some executioners also practiced medicine, particularly bone setting and treatment of wounds, using skills developed through their intimate knowledge of human anatomy. This medical practice often provided a substantial portion of their income and occasionally offered a path to greater social acceptance. The torturer's arsenal evolved over the centuries, becoming increasingly sophisticated in its ability to inflict pain without causing immediate death. Each device and technique was designed with a specific purpose, whether to extract confessions, punish the convicted, or execute those deemed beyond redemption. The rack, a wooden frame upon which victims were fastened while their limbs were gradually stretched, was among the most common devices. Its effectiveness lay in the slow escalation of pain and the torturer's ability to increase or decrease the tension according to the victim's responses. The strappado involved binding the victim's hands behind their back and suspending them from a rope, sometimes with weights attached to their feet. The resulting dislocation of shoulders caused excruciating pain, but left no visible marks, making it a favorite of inquisitors who would later present their victims in court as having confessed without torture. Other common tools included thumb screws, which crushed the digits slowly, the pair of anguish, an expandable device inserted into bodily orifices, and the breaking wheel, upon which limbs were systematically shattered. Torturers were expected to be intimately familiar with these tools and skilled in their application. They needed to know precisely how much pain could be inflicted without killing the victim. A premature death during interrogation was considered a serious failure that could result in punishment for the torturer himself. Contrary to popular depictions of dark, underground dungeons filled with exotic devices, most medieval torture chambers were relatively simple spaces. Many were ordinary rooms within town halls, courthouses, or prisons, temporarily converted for the purpose of judicial torture. The most important feature of these chambers was typically not elaborate equipment, but privacy. Torture was generally conducted away from public view, with only essential personnel present: the torturer and his assistants, judicial officials to record confessions, and sometimes a physician to ensure the victim survived long enough to provide the desired information. Lighting was crucial. Torturers needed to see their work clearly to apply techniques with precision and to monitor the victim's physical state. Consequently, torture chambers were often well lit with candles or lamps, and some even had windows, though these might be covered during sessions. Water, fire, and basic medical supplies were standard features of these spaces, allowing the torturer to revive unconscious victims and treat injuries just enough to allow the torture to continue. For most torturers, their profession was not a full-time occupation. Executions and judicial torture sessions were relatively infrequent events in all but the largest cities. In smaller towns, an executioner might go weeks or months between official duties. During these intervals, executioners pursued other occupations. Many practiced medicine or served as knackers, disposing of animal carcasses, roles that, like torture, placed them in contact with elements of society considered unclean or taboo. When called upon to perform their official duties, torturers typically followed a prescribed routine. Before a judicial torture session, they would prepare their equipment, ensuring that all devices were functional and that necessary supplies, bandages, water, stimulants to revive unconscious victims were on hand. During the session, they worked under the direction of judicial officials who specified the techniques to be used and determined when to increase intensity or cease altogether. The torturer was expected to demonstrate both technical skill and emotional detachment, applying pain methodically while remaining unmoved by the victim's suffering. After an execution or torture session, the torturer was responsible for cleaning and maintaining his equipment, disposing of any remains, and in some cases providing a report to authorities on the effectiveness of the procedures employed. Perhaps the most consistent aspect of the torturer's existence across medieval Europe was their profound social isolation. Executioners and torturers were considered dishonorable, a formal legal status in many regions that placed them outside normal society, alongside prostitutes, gravediggers, and others whose occupations involved contact with taboo elements. This dishonor was contagious. The mere touch of an executioner was believed to contaminate, and many people would go to extraordinary lengths to avoid physical contact with these social pariahs. In parts of Germany, an executioner was required to wear distinctive clothing or badges identifying his profession, while in France, executioners often lived in isolated houses outside city walls. The extent of this ostracism can be seen in church regulations. In many parishes, executioners were forbidden from sitting with the congregation, and instead stood at the back or in a specially designated area. They were often barred from receiving communion directly from the priest's hand, and instead had the host placed on a long-handled spoon to avoid physical contact. Marriage prospects for executioners were severely limited by their social status. Few families would willingly give their daughters to men of such dishonor, leading to the formation of intermarrying networks of executioner families across regions. In some areas, the daughters of executioners were themselves considered dishonored and could only marry men of similar status, creating isolated communities bound together by their shared stigma. Children born into these families inherited their parents' dishonorable status, trapped in a cycle that persisted across generations. Despite these challenges, records indicate that many executioners maintained stable family lives. The journals of Franz Schmidt reveal a man deeply devoted to his wife and children, concerned with providing them financial security and shielding them as much as possible from the consequences of his profession. For the children of executioners, childhood was marked by exclusion and often cruelty from peers. Many grew up assisting their fathers, gradually being introduced to aspects of the trade, a process that surely left profound psychological scars. Despite their pariah status, executioners did enjoy certain privileges that partially offset their social isolation. Many were granted legal exemptions, including freedom from certain taxes and duties required of other citizens. Executioners often held a monopoly on services considered unclean but necessary, such as removing animal carcasses from public areas, clearing cesspits, and in some regions, providing medical services to those injured in accidents or suffering from venereal diseases. These monopolies could be quite profitable. Records from several German cities indicate that some executioners became wealthy through these additional enterprises, though their wealth rarely translated into social acceptance. Perhaps most valuable was the protection afforded by their position. Few would dare to physically threaten or assault an executioner, both out of fear of their strength and skill, and concern that such actions might be interpreted as interference with royal or judicial authority. Modern psychological understanding allows us to recognize that torturers themselves likely suffered profound trauma from their work. Constantly inflicting extreme pain and witnessing human suffering would have psychological consequences regardless of the cultural context or belief system. Historical records provide glimpses of this trauma. The memoirs of executioners like Franz Schmidt and Charles Henry Sanson reveal men troubled by nightmares, excessive drinking, and periods of deep melancholy that we might now recognize as depression or post-traumatic stress. Religious confessions and last wills of executioners frequently express concern for their souls and requests for extraordinary numbers of masses to be said after their deaths, suggesting deep spiritual anxiety about the moral implications of their work. Some torturers developed elaborate rationalization systems. Many convinced themselves that by expertly inflicting pain, they were actually being merciful. A skilled torturer could extract a confession quickly, whereas an amateur might prolong suffering needlessly. Others embraced religious justifications, believing they were serving God by punishing sinners or extracting confessions that might save souls. To function in their role, torturers developed various psychological defenses. Dehumanization of victims was common. By viewing the condemned as deserving of their fate or as something less than fully human, torturers could distance themselves from the moral implications of their actions. Compartmentalization allowed some to separate their professional and personal lives. Historical accounts describe executioners who were gentle fathers and husbands, kind to animals, and even respected for their fairness in business dealings, despite the cruelty they displayed in their official duties. Alcohol provided another means of coping. Records from across Europe note that executioners were often provided with wine or spirits before executions, a practice justified as ensuring steady hands, but likely serving also to dull moral qualms and emotional responses. Some torturers found solace in technical perfection, focusing intensely on the skilled execution of their duties rather than their human consequences. The ideal of the clean kill, a beheading accomplished in a single stroke, became a point of professional pride for many executioners. Beyond trauma in the modern clinical sense, medieval torturers likely suffered from what we would now call moral injury, psychological harm resulting from perpetrating, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts that violate one's moral beliefs. To manage this injury, torturers relied heavily on the legitimizing frameworks provided by authority. By viewing themselves as mere instruments of judicial will, they could shift moral responsibility to the judges and officials who ordered the torture. The refrain, "I am just following orders," has echoed through centuries of human atrocity, beginning perhaps with these early professional perpetrators of sanctioned violence. Religious justification offered another avenue for moral relief. In a society where the Church sanctioned torture as a means of combating heresy and extracting confessions that might save souls from eternal damnation, torturers could view themselves as reluctant participants in a necessary spiritual battle. Some sought to offset their professional deeds through charity or religious devotion. Records show executioners making substantial donations to churches, funding masses, and performing acts of charity, perhaps in an attempt to balance their moral ledger. Despite their social stigma, torturers were highly skilled professionals whose expertise was valued by authorities. Effective torture required detailed knowledge of human anatomy, psychology, and the technical properties of various devices. A skilled torturer knew precisely how to apply pain to maximize suffering while minimizing the risk of premature death. They understood which techniques would produce quick confessions and which would result in longer suffering. This knowledge was hard-won through apprenticeship and experience, representing a significant investment of time and effort. Beyond torture, executioners needed to master various methods of killing. A clean beheading required understanding of anatomy and considerable physical strength and precision. Hanging with the short drop, common in the medieval period, required careful calculation of rope length and knot positioning to ensure death by asphyxiation rather than the slower death of strangulation or the instant death of cervical fracture. This expertise gave torturers a certain professional pride and identity that partially offset their social isolation. Within their professional community, skill was recognized and respected, creating a hierarchy based on technical competence rather than birth or wealth. The torturer's intimate familiarity with human anatomy often led to secondary careers in medicine. In many regions, executioners were sought out as healers, particularly for ailments involving bones and joints. This medical practice existed in a legal gray area. Official medical practitioners, physicians and barber surgeons often objected to executioners treating patients, viewing it as encroachment on their professional territory. However, the general population, particularly the poor who couldn't afford established medical care, frequently turned to executioners for treatment. Some executioners developed genuine medical expertise. Historical records describe executioners successfully treating fractures, dislocations, and wounds, sometimes with greater skill than university-trained physicians of the period. The executioner's practical knowledge of anatomy, gained through dissection of executed criminals, officially sanctioned in many regions, often exceeded the theoretical knowledge of formal medical practitioners. For the torturer, this healing role may have provided some psychological balance to their destructive official duties, as well as supplementary income during periods when their main profession was not required. Public executions in medieval and early modern Europe were theatrical events, with the executioner serving as a central performer in a carefully choreographed spectacle of justice. These events drew large crowds and followed ritual patterns that reinforced social order and royal authority. The executioner's role in these spectacles was complex. They needed to project authority and competence, while also demonstrating appropriate solemnity for what was ostensibly a somber occasion of justice. An executioner who appeared to take too much pleasure in his work risked inflaming the crowd, while one who showed reluctance or incompetence undermined the authority of the state. Skilled executioners understood the importance of this performance aspect. They developed distinctive styles of dress, movement, and speech for public appearances. Some became known for particular rituals, such as asking forgiveness from the condemned before execution or offering specific prayers. The most successful executioners became celebrities of a sort, their names known throughout their regions. The executioner of Paris, traditionally addressed as Monsieur de Paris, enjoyed a particularly elevated status, with some holders of the office becoming wealthy through memoirs and achieving a degree of social acceptance unusual for their profession. While torturers inflicted suffering directly, they were rarely the originators of the violence they perpetrated. They operated as instruments of authority, judicial, royal, or ecclesiastical, carrying out decisions made by others. This position as intermediary placed torturers in a precarious situation. They were expected to effectively implement the will of authority without exceeding their mandate. A torturer who failed to extract a confession might be viewed as incompetent or even sympathetic to the accused, while one who caused premature death might face punishment for depriving authorities of valuable information or the opportunity for a public execution. The relationship between torturers and their employers was often characterized by mutual distrust. Authorities relied on torturers' skills, but remained wary of who were comfortable with violence and existed outside normal social constraints. Torturers, meanwhile, were dependent on authorities for their livelihood, but knew they could be sacrificed if political winds shifted. This dynamic created complex power relationships. Records from several European regions describe instances where executioners refused certain orders or negotiated the terms of particularly difficult executions, leveraging their specialized skills to gain concessions from their nominal superiors. Perhaps surprisingly, some historical accounts reveal torturers occasionally acting as advocates for the condemned. Having witnessed the effects of extreme suffering firsthand and understanding the unreliability of confessions extracted under torture, some developed skepticism about the justice of the systems they served. Franz Schmidt's journal records instances where he argued for mercy for certain prisoners, particularly young offenders, or those he believed had been falsely accused. The memoirs of Charles-Henri Sanson, executioner of Paris during the French Revolution, describe his dismay at some of the political executions he was required to perform. Some executioners use their professional knowledge to minimize suffering when possible. Techniques existed to render the condemned unconscious before painful executions, to position nooses for quicker death, or to sharpen blades to exceptional keenness for clean beheadings. While not officially sanctioned, these merciful techniques appear in executioners' private writings. In a few documented cases, executioners even help prisoners escape, either due to personal conviction of their innocence or in exchange for bribes. Such actions carried enormous risk, as an executioner caught subverting justice would likely face execution himself. Few people in medieval society had such consistent, intimate contact with death and suffering as torturers and executioners. This proximity fundamentally altered their relationship with mortality, creating a psychological distance that separated them from their communities. Religious writings of the period suggest that this familiarity with death was viewed as spiritually dangerous. By handling the dead and inflicting suffering regularly, executioners were believed to become tainted, their souls damaged by constant exposure to the most fearful aspects of human existence. Some executioners developed rituals to manage this spiritual contamination. Records describe executioners asking forgiveness from their victims before execution, making the sign of the cross after completing their duties, or saying specific prayers believed to protect them from spiritual harm. The psychological impact of this constant proximity to death likely contributed to the high rates of alcoholism noted among executioners in historical records. It may also explain the superstitious beliefs that surrounded these figures. In a society where most people encountered death rarely and under carefully controlled ritual circumstances, those who dealt with it regularly seemed to exist in a different spiritual realm. Despite their central role in medieval justice systems, torturers have been largely erased from historical memory. Few are known by name outside specialist historical circles, and their perspectives are rarely considered in historical accounts of the periods in which they lived. This erasure stems partly from the nature of historical records. As members of dishonorable professions, torturers were often excluded from official documentation, except in their professional capacity. Many were illiterate, leaving no written accounts of their experiences, and those who could write often chose not to document their professional activities for fear of further stigmatizing their families. The few exceptions, such as the journals of Franz Schmidt or the memoirs of Charles-Henri Sanson, provide invaluable glimpses into the lives and thoughts of these marginalized figures, revealing complexities that challenge simplistic moral judgments. Modern historians have begun to recover these forgotten perspectives, recognizing that understanding the torturer is essential to comprehending the full complexity of medieval justice and society. This work reveals that torturers were neither simply monsters nor merely victims of circumstance, but complex individuals navigating a moral landscape far different from our own. In popular culture, medieval torturers have been reduced to stock characters, sadistic villains in black hoods who exist primarily to demonstrate the cruelty of past societies or to provide macabre entertainment. These representations rarely acknowledge the social, economic, and psychological realities that shaped actual torturers' lives. This simplification serves various narrative purposes. In historical dramas, one-dimensional torturer characters provide convenient antagonists, while avoiding the more uncomfortable reality that torture was sanctioned by the highest authorities of church and state. In horror fiction, medieval torture devices and techniques are exaggerated for shock value, divorced from their historical contexts. More nuanced portrayals have emerged in some historical novels and films, depicting torturers as reluctant participants in systems they did not create, or as individuals struggling with the moral implications of their duties. These works begin to restore humanity to figures long denied it, without excusing the suffering they inflicted. The profession of judicial torture gradually disappeared across Europe between the 17th and 19th centuries, as Enlightenment values influenced legal reforms and torture was increasingly recognized as both inhumane and unreliable for extracting truth. For the families who had practiced this profession for generations, this transition presented both opportunities and challenges. Some leveraged their medical knowledge to become legitimate healthcare providers, while others found work in slaughterhouses or as tanners, occupations that, while still considered somewhat dishonorable, carried less stigma than torture. The last official judicial torturer in France was dismissed in 1788, shortly before the Revolution. In Germany, the position persisted somewhat longer in certain regions, with the last hereditary executioner retiring in the mid-19th century. By 1850, virtually all European nations had abolished judicial torture, though execution as punishment continued. This transition marked the end of a distinct social class that had existed for centuries. People who had lived at the intersection of authority and criminality, simultaneously essential to the functioning of justice systems and rejected by the societies they served. The medieval torturer stands as a reminder of the complexity of historical moral judgment. These were individuals who inflicted terrible suffering on others, yet did so within systems that not only permitted but required such actions for what was perceived as the greater good of justice and social order. Neither innocent victims nor freely choosing monsters, torturers occupied an ambiguous moral space that challenges our tendency towards simple categorization. They were both perpetrators and prisoners of their circumstances, men who caused immense suffering, while often suffering themselves from trauma, social isolation, and the psychological burden of their duties. Understanding these figures in their full complexity does not excuse the pain they inflicted. Rather, it reminds us that systems of cruelty rarely rely on exceptionally evil individuals, but instead on ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances, operating within frameworks that normalize and justify violence. Perhaps the most important lesson from examining the lives of medieval torturers is recognizing how institutional authority can transform violence from criminal act to civic duty, and how social systems can trap individuals in roles they neither chose nor desired. This understanding challenges us to examine our own society's institutions and the moral compromises they may demand of those who serve them. In recovering the humanity of these shadowy historical figures, we gain not only a more nuanced view of the past, but also a more clear-eyed understanding of how cruelty functions in human societies, not primarily through the actions of inherently evil individuals, but through systems that distribute moral responsibility in ways that allow terrible deeds to be committed in the name of justice, security, or faith. While torture was practiced throughout medieval Europe, regional variations in methods, social status, and institutional frameworks created distinctly different experiences for torturers across the continent. Nowhere was this more evident than in Spain during the Inquisition, 1478 to 1834, where torture became systematized to an unprecedented degree. Unlike their counterparts elsewhere in Europe, the torturers of the Spanish Inquisition operated within a highly bureaucratic system with detailed written protocols. The 1561 Instructions of Toledo specified precisely which torture methods could be used, how long they could be applied, and what questions could be asked. This bureaucratization created a different psychological environment for the torturer, who could hide behind procedural correctness rather than taking personal responsibility for decisions about intensity or duration. Spanish inquisitorial torturers were often specialists who performed only torture, not executions, creating a professional distinction that didn't exist in many other regions. These specialists worked alongside notaries who recorded every groan, confession, and plea from the victim, creating a documentation system that remains one of our primary sources for understanding torture practices. Perhaps most distinctively, the Spanish Inquisition's torturers operated under the peculiar restriction that they could not draw blood or cause permanent physical damage, limitations that led to the refinement of psychological torture and techniques like waterboarding that left no visible marks but caused extreme suffering. In England, torture played a less central role in the legal system than in continental Europe. Judicial torture was reserved primarily for cases of treason and required a special warrant from the monarch or privy council. Consequently, English executioners specialized more in public execution than in extracting confessions. The English hangman became a unique cultural figure, more public and sometimes more integrated into society than his continental counterparts. While still socially marginalized, English executioners frequently supplemented their income by selling souvenirs at executions and writing pamphlets about famous criminals they had dispatched. Tyburn in London, where public executions were conducted from the 12th to the 18th century, developed its own ritual practices. The Tyburn Fair that surrounded executions created a carnival atmosphere where the executioner performed not just as an agent of justice, but as a central entertainer in a macabre public spectacle. English executioners were typically appointed rather than inheriting their position, though some families like the Billingtons and Pierrepoints did establish dynasties in the profession. They were paid per execution rather than receiving a regular salary, creating financial incentives for swift work that sometimes compromised the quality of their executions. In the fragmented political landscape of medieval and Renaissance Italy, city-states developed distinctive approaches to justice and punishment. Many Italian cities employed an official known as the Bargello, who combined the roles of police chief, jailer, and supervisor of executions. Under the Bargello served professional torturers who were often more formally integrated into the civic bureaucracy than their counterparts elsewhere. In Florence, for example, torturers received regular salaries and held a recognized, if low, position in the civic hierarchy. Some even belonged to guilds, providing a degree of professional recognition unusual in other regions. Italian torturers became particularly skilled in psychological torture techniques. The strappado was refined in Italian cities, and the use of sleep deprivation and threat manipulation reached new levels of sophistication. These techniques influenced inquisitorial practices throughout Europe, as Italian methods were adopted by ecclesiastical courts. The theatrical aspect of punishment was especially pronounced in Italian cities, where elaborate public executions served as demonstrations of state power. Torturers in these contexts became directors of complex performances, choreographing suffering and death as civic spectacles designed to reinforce social order. While the vast majority of torturers and executioners were men, historical records reveal rare instances of women performing these roles. These exceptional cases typically occurred when a male executioner died suddenly, leaving a widow who temporarily took over his duties until a permanent replacement could be appointed. In 1587, the widow of the executioner of Würzburg in Germany carried out several executions after her husband's death. In early 18th century Sweden, Anna Mortensdotter became an unofficial assistant to the Stockholm executioner after her husband was executed for theft, eventually performing executions herself when the official executioner was incapacitated by alcohol. These women faced even greater social ostracism than their male counterparts, as they violated not only the taboos associated with execution, but also gender norms of the period. Their stories reveal both the extreme circumstances that could lead women into this male-dominated profession and the flexibility of supposedly rigid gender roles in times of necessity. Far more common than female executioners were the women who lived alongside male torturers as wives, daughters, and mothers. These women shared in the social stigma of their male relatives, while receiving none of the limited respect accorded to the men for their official function. The wife of an executioner typically managed a household that few would enter willingly. She could not shop in regular markets, as many vendors refused to sell to executioners' families or insisted they not touch goods before purchasing them. Her children were often excluded from schools and religious education, forcing her to become their primary teacher. Many executioners' wives assisted their husbands in their secondary occupations, particularly in medical practice. Records from several German towns describe the wives of executioners preparing herbal remedies, setting bones, and treating wounds, developing medical expertise that occasionally led to independent practice after their husbands' deaths. For daughters of executioners, life presented limited options. Marriage prospects were generally restricted to the sons of other executioners or men of similarly dishonorable professions. Some records indicate arrangements between executioner families across different regions, creating marriage networks that spanned considerable distances. Despite these challenges, evidence suggests that many executioners' families maintained strong internal bonds. The shared experience of social ostracism likely strengthened family cohesion, creating tight-knit units that provided emotional support in the face of external rejection. Women constituted a significant portion of torture victims during the medieval period, particularly during witch hunts that swept through Europe between the 15th and 18th centuries. Female torturers, had they existed in significant numbers, would have faced the particular psychological burden of inflicting suffering on their own gender in a society that generally viewed women as more physically vulnerable than men. Records of torture sessions involving female victims reveal modifications to standard techniques based on gender. Women accused of witchcraft were typically subjected to prolonged sleep deprivation and psychological pressure before physical torture began, exploiting what contemporary authorities viewed as women's greater susceptibility to mental breakdown. Some torture methods were specifically designed for, or most commonly used on women. Witch prickers used long needles to pierce women's bodies, searching for spots that didn't bleed or cause pain, supposedly marks of the devil. The breast ripper, as its name suggests, was designed specifically to torture women by mutilating the breasts. For male torturers, interactions with female victims introduced additional complexities. Church authorities worried about the sexual implications of male torturers stripping and touching female bodies, leading to regulations requiring female witnesses during the torture of women. These regulations were often ignored in practice, creating situations ripe for sexual abuse that rarely appears in official records but is occasionally mentioned in private accounts. The practice of torture in medieval Europe was supported by elaborate theological justifications, particularly after its reintroduction into European legal systems following the revival of Roman law in the 12th century. These justifications provided torturers with a moral framework that potentially eased their psychological burden. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential theologians of the medieval period, justified judicial torture as a means of discovering truth, arguing that physical pain could be legitimately inflicted to protect the greater good of society. This utilitarian argument became a cornerstone of torture's legitimacy in both secular and ecclesiastical courts. For torturers working for the Inquisition, additional theological justifications were available. Inquisitors argued that heresy was a spiritual contagion that threatened the salvation of entire communities. In this context, causing temporary physical suffering to extract confessions could be seen as an act of mercy that might save not only the soul of the heretic, through confession and repentance, but also the souls of those who might otherwise be corrupted. Some theological writers even drew parallels between the torturer and Christ, suggesting that just as Christ suffered to redeem humanity, the torturer inflicted redemptive suffering that could lead to confession, repentance, and spiritual salvation. This extreme justification appears in several inquisitorial manuals and likely provided significant psychological comfort to those engaged in causing suffering for religious purposes. Despite popular perceptions of medieval torture as unlimited and arbitrary, the practice was actually governed by complex legal frameworks that placed significant restrictions on torturers. These limitations varied by region and period, but generally included regulations on which methods could be used, how long torture could continue, and how many sessions were permitted. In most jurisdictions, torture could only be applied when there was already significant evidence against the accused. It was meant to confirm guilt rather than establish it from scratch. Confessions extracted under torture typically needed to be repeated later, away from the torture chamber, to be considered valid. Many legal systems prohibited torturing certain categories of people, including nobles, pregnant women, children under a certain age, and the elderly. Physicians were often required to certify that an individual was physically capable of withstanding torture before it could begin. For the torturer, these regulations created a complex professional environment. They needed to be familiar with legal limitations, while also satisfying the demands of judges and authorities who wanted results. When torture failed to produce a confession, as it sometimes did when the accused was innocent or extraordinarily resistant to pain, torturers could find themselves blamed for incompetence or excessive leniency. Beyond inflicting pain, torturers served an important legal function as witnesses to confessions. Their testimony about what was said during torture sessions carried significant weight in court proceedings, giving them influence beyond the torture chamber. This role required torturers to pay careful attention to the specific words used by victims during torture, distinguishing between genuine confessions and incoherent cries of pain. It also created the potential for corruption, as torturers could theoretically misrepresent what was said to ensure convictions. To guard against such corruption, many jurisdictions required the presence of court officials during torture sessions. These officials created official records of proceedings that served as the basis for later legal action. The torturer's testimony needed to align with these records, creating a system of checks that somewhat limited their power. The dual role of torturer and witness complicated the professional identity of these men. They were simultaneously instruments of physical coercion and participants in the intellectual process of determining truth and guilt, a contradiction that likely contributed to the psychological complexity of their position. The physical separation of torturers from mainstream society was often enforced through housing arrangements. In many European cities, executioners and their families were required to live in designated houses, typically located on the outskirts of town or near other dishonorable establishments like tanneries or slaughterhouses. These executioners' houses were often owned by the municipality and passed from one torturer to the next, along with the office. Historical records from German cities describe these houses as being deliberately situated near city gates or along less traveled roads, minimizing the residents' contact with other citizens. In some regions, executioners' homes were marked with distinctive signs or symbols. In parts of Germany, a red axe painted on the door identified the residents. These markers served both to warn ordinary citizens who might wish to avoid contact and to direct those seeking the executioner's services, particularly medical assistance. Despite their isolation, executioners' houses were often substantial buildings, reflecting the reasonable income these officials could earn. Inventories from executioners' estates indicate that many lived in relative material comfort, with household goods of decent quality. This material success in the face of social exclusion created a paradoxical existence, comfortable in physical terms, but impoverished in social connections. In many regions, torturers were required to wear distinctive clothing that identified their profession. This served both to warn others of their contaminating presence and to reinforce their official status when performing their duties. The stereotypical black hood associated with executioners in popular culture was indeed used in some contexts, particularly during executions, but was far from universal. More commonly, executioners wore distinctive colored clothing, often red or yellow, colors associated with dishonor in medieval color symbolism, or specific badges or patches that marked their status. When not performing official duties, many torturers attempted to minimize these visual distinctions to avoid harassment. Historical records describe conflicts arising when executioners were discovered attempting to dress like ordinary citizens at markets or religious services, highlighting the importance of visual markers in maintaining social boundaries. For public executions, executioners often adopted more elaborate costumes that emphasized the theatrical nature of their role. The executioner of Paris traditionally wore a sword and fine clothing for important executions, while German executioners might don special decorated outfits for major public events. This ceremonial dress transformed the torturer from social pariah to embodiment of state authority. if only temporarily. The economic position of torturers varied widely across regions and periods, but many earned substantial incomes despite their social marginalization. Payment typically came from multiple sources, creating a complex economic portfolio. Official salaries provided a base income, supplemented by fees for specific services. These fees were often graduated according to the complexity of the task. A simple hanging might bring a small payment, while breaking on the wheel or a complex torture session commanded premium rates. Records from 16th century German cities indicate that executioners could earn more per day for certain procedures than skilled craftsmen earned in a week. Secondary occupations significantly enhanced this income. Medical practice, animal disposal, and the cleaning of cesspits all provided steady revenue streams. Some executioners engaged in the sale of items believed to have magical properties. Pieces of the gallows, rope from hangings, or even the fat of executed criminals, which was believed to have healing properties. This financial success created a peculiar situation where torturers often had more disposable income than many respectable citizens, but remained unable to translate this wealth into social status. They could not join guilds, purchase property in certain areas, or engage in many forms of commerce. Their wealth remained partially segregated from the mainstream economy, creating parallel economic networks among the dishonorable professions. The systematic use of judicial torture began to decline in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, gradually transforming the role of the torturer. This decline resulted from a combination of Enlightenment philosophy, empirical skepticism about torture's effectiveness, and changing religious attitudes. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria in Italy and Voltaire in France published influential critiques of torture, arguing that it was both inhumane and unreliable as a method of determining truth. Their works influenced legal reforms across Europe, with Frederick the Great of Prussia becoming one of the first European monarchs to abolish judicial torture in 1740. For torturers, this transition period created professional uncertainty. In regions where torture was abolished but execution remained legal, they lost a significant portion of their duties and income. Some adapted by focusing more on their secondary occupations, particularly medicine, while others sought to redefine their role within changing justice systems. The decline was gradual and uneven. While torture was officially abolished in France in 1780 and in most German states by 1800, it persisted in practice in many regions well into the 19th century. Spain's Inquisition, which had refined torture to a bureaucratic science, was not abolished until 1834. The final generation of official torturers faced the challenge of adapting to a world where their primary skills were no longer legally sanctioned. Historical records provide glimpses of these men navigating the twilight of their profession. Charles-Henri Sanson, who served as executioner of Paris during the French Revolution and executed King Louis XVI, represents this transitional figure. Though he no longer performed judicial torture, he witnessed the massive increase in executions during the Terror, and later documented his experiences in memoirs that sought to humanize his profession. In German territories, where the tradition of executioner families was particularly strong, the end of judicial torture forced significant professional adjustments. Some executioner dynasties successfully transitioned into full-time medical practice, leveraging their anatomical knowledge and healing traditions to gain new social acceptance. Others found their skills unexpectedly valuable in new contexts. When anatomy became a central focus of medical education in the 18th and 19th centuries, former torturers were sometimes hired by medical schools for their expertise in dissection and anatomical knowledge. creating an unexpected path to respectability. Though the formal role of torturer has disappeared from legal systems in developed nations, the moral questions raised by their existence continue to resonate in discussions of professional ethics. Modern military personnel, police officers, intelligence agents, and medical professionals still grapple with questions about the ethics of inflicting harm in service to authority. The defense that torturers were just following orders anticipated similar claims made by participants in 20th century atrocities, raising enduring questions about individual moral responsibility within authoritarian systems. The psychological mechanisms that allowed medieval torturers to compartmentalize their actions have parallels in studies of modern professionals who participate in enhanced interrogation or other forms of sanctioned violence. Medical professionals face particularly complex ethical questions that echo the torturer's dilemma. The participation of doctors in executions, force-feeding of prisoners, or interrogations raises questions about the proper limits of professional service to authority. Questions that medieval torturers navigated without the benefit of formal ethical frameworks. Even in legal systems, the shadow of the torturer lingers in debates about proportional punishment, the purpose of incarceration, and the state's right to inflict suffering. The torturer, though no longer an official position, remains a powerful symbol in discussions about the moral limits of state power and professional obligation. The medieval torturer represents one of history's most challenging moral case studies, a figure who causes tremendous suffering while embedded within systems that define that suffering as necessary and just. Neither fully autonomous moral agent nor mindless tool of authority, the torturer inhabited an ambiguous middle ground that defies simple categorization. By recovering the humanity of these historical figures, their daily lives, their psychological burdens, their social realities, we gain insight not only into a particular historical profession, but also into the broader human capacity to normalize violence when it is sanctioned by authority and tradition. The torturer becomes a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about institutional power and moral responsibility. The testimony of those few torturers who left written records reveals men who were, in many ways, ordinary, concerned with supporting their families, maintaining professional pride, and reconciling their actions with their religious beliefs. This ordinariness is perhaps more disturbing than any sadistic pathology would be, as it suggests that the capacity to inflict suffering lies not in exceptional monstrosity, but in common human vulnerability to institutional pressures and financial necessity. For contemporary readers, the torturer's burden offers a warning about how systems can distribute moral responsibility in ways that enable cruelty. When violence is fragmented across multiple roles and authorized by distant authorities, the full moral weight of suffering becomes diffused, allowing ordinary individuals to participate in extraordinary harm. Yet the torturer's story also contains moments of moral resistance and human connection that transcend their grim profession. In The Executioner Who Argued for Mercy, the torturer who minimized suffering when possible, and the professional who struggled with nightmares and sought religious absolution, we see the persistent human tendency to seek moral meaning even within the most compromised circumstances. These shadowy figures from the past, long reduced to black-hooded stereotypes in popular imagination, deserve recovery as full historical subjects, not to excuse their actions, but to understand the complex interplay of institutional power, economic necessity, and psychological adaptation that allowed judicial torture to persist for centuries. In their complicated lives, we may recognize patterns that, troublingly, continue to enable institutionalized cruelty in our own time. In medieval society, torturers occupied a space in the popular imagination that combined fear, fascination, and supernatural association. Folk beliefs about executioners emerged across Europe, reflecting the ambiguous position these figures held in the social order. Many communities believed that executioners possessed magical abilities, particularly healing powers derived from their intimate contact with death. The executioner's touch was thought to cure certain ailments, especially goiters, epilepsy, and skin diseases. This belief stemmed from the concept that someone who could take life might also have power to preserve it, a magical balance that placed the executioner in a liminal space between healer and killer. Executioners' tools were similarly invested with supernatural significance. Swords used for beheadings were believed to retain power that could be transferred through touch. Gallows wood was highly prized for its supposed magical properties, and small pieces were stolen to be carried as talismans against disease or misfortune. The rope used in hangings was particularly valued, with pieces sold as protection against everything from toothaches to infertility. These supernatural associations further isolated torturers from ordinary society. They were approached furtively by those seeking magical remedies, but avoided in normal social contexts, creating interactions defined by transactional necessity rather than human connection. Medieval literature and drama rarely portrayed torturers as central characters, instead positioning them as fearsome background figures who embodied the power and cruelty of authority. In mystery plays depicting the Passion of Christ, the torturers who scourged Jesus were often portrayed as particularly brutal, becoming symbolic representations of human cruelty rather than developed characters. When torturers did receive more detailed treatment in medieval literature, they were frequently portrayed as either inhuman monsters or reluctant servants forced to perform their duties against their will. The complexity of their actual social and psychological position rarely appeared in these simplified depictions. This literary tradition established patterns of representation that would persist for centuries. From Shakespeare's executioners, typically portrayed as coarse but occasionally sympathetic, to Gothic fiction's sadistic torturers, literary depictions continue to oscillate between demonization and reluctant sympathy, rarely capturing the complex reality of the historical figures. Contemporary popular culture has inherited and often amplified medieval misconceptions about torturers. Film and television depictions typically fall into predictable patterns: the sadistic, pleasure-taking torturer, the coldly efficient professional, or occasionally the reluctant executioner with a heart of gold. Modern depictions rarely acknowledge the social and economic realities that shape torturers' lives, instead focusing on psychological explanations that emphasize individual pathology over institutional contexts. This approach mirrors broader tendencies to attribute historical cruelty to monstrous individuals rather than examining the systems that enabled and required their actions. Video games and other interactive media have further transformed the medieval torturer into a stock villain, often appearing as boss enemies in fantasy settings or as background elements in historical recreations. These depictions typically exaggerate the technological sophistication of torture devices and the frequency of their use, creating a distorted image of medieval justice. These misconceptions matter not merely as historical inaccuracies, but as barriers to understanding the complex moral questions raised by sanctioned violence. By relegating torturers to the realm of monsters or reducing them to reluctant heroes, popular culture avoids confronting the uncomfortable reality that ordinary people can become instruments of extraordinary cruelty when placed in systems that normalize violence. Archaeological excavations have provided valuable insights into the physical realities of torture, sometimes confirming and sometimes challenging written accounts. Excavations of medieval prisons and judicial facilities have uncovered the remains of torture chambers, revealing details about their construction and use that complement documentary evidence. Contrary to popular imagination, archaeological evidence suggests that many torture chambers were relatively simple spaces rather than elaborate dungeons filled with exotic devices. Most contained only a few key implements: chains for restraint, braziers for heating irons, and basic furniture for securing victims. The elaborate mechanical devices depicted in later illustrations appear to have been relatively rare. Excavations at the Bargello in Florence revealed a torture chamber with a large fireplace for heating implements, drainage channels in the stone floor, and iron rings embedded in the walls for securing prisoners. Similar features have been found in judicial buildings across Europe, suggesting a degree of standardization in these spaces. The relative simplicity of archaeological findings highlights the importance of the torturer's personal skill rather than mechanical sophistication. With limited tools, the effectiveness of torture depended heavily on the practitioner's knowledge of human anatomy and psychology, expertise developed through apprenticeship and experience. Surviving torture implements provide tangible connections to the physical reality of medieval judicial violence. Museums across Europe house collections of these objects, though many are later reproductions rather than authentic medieval tools. Authentic implements that have survived include thumb screws, leg irons, branding irons, and various restraints. These objects often show signs of repeated use and repair, indicating that they were practical tools rather than ceremonial items. The craftsmanship evident in many surviving implements suggests that they were made by skilled artisans, perhaps specializing in tools for judicial use. Particularly valuable are implements that bear makers' marks or ownership inscriptions. Some torture devices from German cities bear the mark of the blacksmith who created them and the city's coat of arms, indicating that they were officially commissioned items rather than improvised tools. These markings help trace the networks of production that supported judicial torture. Forensic analysis of human remains has provided additional evidence about torture practices. Skeletons showing characteristic damage from specific torture methods have been recovered from execution cemeteries and mass graves. These physical traces sometimes reveal techniques not documented in written sources, expanding our understanding of torture's practical application. Archaeological investigation of execution sites has yielded insights into both the practical arrangements for public punishment and the social meaning of these spaces. Excavations at Tyburn in London, the Galgenberg, Gallows Hill, in various German cities, and other execution grounds have uncovered the physical infrastructure of judicial killing. These sites typically featured permanent gallows structures, sometimes with multiple pillars and crossbeams to allow several executions simultaneously. Around these structures, archaeologists have found evidence of temporary platforms for officials and honored guests, suggesting that the spatial arrangement of executions reinforced social hierarchies even in death. The location of execution sites reveals their symbolic importance. Most were positioned at city boundaries or major crossroads, liminal spaces that reinforced the condemned person's exclusion from the community while ensuring maximum visibility for the execution's deterrent effect. This placement also kept the pollution of death at a comfortable distance from the city center, while remaining accessible to urban populations. Burial practices at execution sites further illustrate the social exclusion of both the executed and their executioners. Many execution grounds included burial areas for those denied church burial, not only executed criminals but also suicides and others who died bad deaths. In some regions, executioners themselves were buried in these unconsecrated grounds, physically separated from respectable society even in death. The most direct windows into torturers' minds come from the rare personal writings they left behind. These documents provide invaluable insights into how these men understood their roles and managed the psychological burden of their profession. The Diary of Franz Schmidt, executioner of Nuremberg from 1578 to 1617, stands as perhaps the most important of these documents. Schmidt recorded not only his professional activities, 1,394 executions and countless torture sessions, but also his personal reflections. His writings reveal a man who took pride in his technical skill while remaining troubled by aspects of his work, particularly the execution of those he believed to be innocent or deserving of mercy. The memoirs of Charles Henry Sanson, executioner of Paris during the French Revolution, offer another crucial perspective. Writing after his retirement, Sanson attempted to justify his role in revolutionary executions while expressing private doubts about the justice of many deaths he facilitated. His writings display the complex psychological negotiations required to maintain self-respect while serving as an instrument of controversial authority. Less extensive but equally revealing are the last wills and testaments of executioners. Many requested extraordinary numbers of masses for their souls, suggesting deep anxiety about their spiritual fate. Others left specific instructions for their funerals, often requesting burial in consecrated ground despite traditions excluding executioners from church cemeteries. These final wishes reveal concerns about social and spiritual redemption that likely haunted these men throughout their lives. When executioner positions became vacant, they typically attracted multiple applicants despite the social stigma attached to the role. Letters of application for these positions survive in various municipal archives, providing insights into the motivations and self-perceptions of those who willingly sought this career. Many applicants emphasized their technical qualifications, describing previous experience as assistants or torturers in other jurisdictions. Others highlighted their physical strength and steady nerves, qualities considered essential for clean executions. Some mentioned family traditions in the profession, suggesting that they were already socially committed to the executioner class and therefore ideal candidates. Economic motivations appear prominently in these letters. Applicants frequently mentioned financial hardship, lack of other employment options, and family responsibilities. Some explicitly calculated the potential income from salaries and fees, demonstrating that for many, the financial security of the position outweighed its social costs. Particularly revealing are petitions submitted by executioners to authorities requesting additional compensation, protection from harassment, or permission to practice medicine. These documents often include detailed descriptions of the challenges executioners faced, from physical danger when dealing with resistant prisoners to social hostility from their communities. They provide direct evidence of how torturers understood their social position and negotiated for improvements within the constraints of their status. Modern psychological frameworks offer tools for understanding the mental processes that allow torturers to perform their duties while maintaining psychological stability. Concepts like compartmentalization, moral disengagement, and cognitive dissonance help explain how ordinary individuals could participate in extraordinary cruelty without experiencing debilitating guilt or psychological breakdown. Compartmentalization, the ability to separate one's professional actions from one's self-concept, appears repeatedly in torturers' writings. Franz Schmidt's diary reveals a man who could torture a prisoner in the morning and tend lovingly to his family in the afternoon, maintaining distinct mental categories for these different aspects of his life. Moral disengagement mechanisms described by psychologist Albert Bandura appear in historical accounts of torturers. These include displacement of responsibility, I am just following orders, diffusion of responsibility, sharing the moral burden with judges and other officials, and moral justification, believing that torture serves a greater good. Historical sources show torturers employing all these strategies to maintain psychological equilibrium. Evidence of psychological distress despite these coping mechanisms appears in various forms. Reports of alcoholism among executioners suggest self-medication for emotional pain. References to nightmares, melancholy, and religious anxiety in personal writings indicate that the psychological defenses were imperfect, allowing moral injury to manifest despite attempts to avoid it. The psychological archive, though fragmentary, suggests that medieval torturers experienced many of the same moral and emotional challenges as modern individuals who participate in sanctioned violence. Their strategies for managing these challenges, psychological compartmentalization, reliance on authority structures, and various forms of self-justification, show remarkable continuity with those documented in studies of modern military personnel, prison guards, and others who inflict suffering within institutional frameworks. The lives of medieval torturers offer profound insights into the human capacity for both cruelty and moral resilience. These historical figures inhabited a moral universe vastly different from our own, yet their experiences speak to universal questions about authority, responsibility, and the psychological cost of inflicting suffering. Perhaps the most important conclusion to draw from this examination is that torturers were not monsters but ordinary humans operating within extraordinary systems. The historical evidence contradicts simplistic narratives about sadistic personalities or inherent evil, revealing instead complex individuals navigating severe economic, social, and moral constraints. This recognition challenges us to move beyond comfortable moral distance. If torturers were not fundamentally different from humans but rather ordinary people placed in systems that normalized and required cruelty, then the capacity for sanctioned violence lies not in exceptional moral defects, but in common human vulnerability to institutional pressures, economic necessity, and the dilution of personal responsibility. The torturer thus becomes a troubling mirror, reflecting not medieval barbarity but enduring human tendencies that persist in modern contexts. From the psychology of military personnel in conflict zones to the compartmentalization of those who work in punitive aspects of justice systems, the torturer's moral challenges find echoes in contemporary experiences. Medieval torture systems distributed moral responsibility across multiple participants, diluting the sense of personal accountability that might otherwise have prevented cruelty. Judges ordered torture, but did not implement it. Torturers implemented it, but did not authorize it. Witnesses observed and recorded, but did not directly participate. This fragmentation of moral agency created conditions where no single individual felt fully responsible for the suffering inflicted. Similar patterns emerge in modern institutional violence, where chains of command, bureaucratic procedures, and specialized roles can distance individuals from the moral weight of their collective actions. The medieval torturer's position as an instrument of authority rather than an autonomous moral agent has parallels in various contemporary contexts, from military hierarchies to corporate structures that enable harm while diffusing responsibility. By studying how medieval justice systems distributed responsibility for suffering, we gain insights into how modern institutions might create similar moral buffer zones that enable harmful practices to continue despite individual qualms. The torturer's ambiguous moral position between perpetrator and instrument reveals patterns of institutional functioning that transcend historical periods. Medieval society considered torture necessary, a regrettable but essential tool for determining truth, punishing wrongdoing, and maintaining social order. This framework of necessity created moral space for practices that would otherwise have been recognized as cruel, allowing participants to view themselves as reluctant servants of a greater good rather than as perpetrators of harm. The concept of necessary evil continues to justify institutional violence in various modern contexts. From enhanced interrogation techniques justified by security concerns to punitive incarceration practices defended as deterrents, the argument that certain forms of suffering are regrettably necessary persists in contemporary discourse. The medieval torturer's experience highlights the psychological and social cost of implementing these necessary cruelties. Historical evidence of alcoholism, nightmares, religious anxiety, and social isolation among torturers suggests that inflicting suffering exacts a price from the perpetrator as well as the victim, even when that suffering is culturally sanctioned. This historical perspective challenges modern societies to consider whether practices defended as necessary evils truly justify their human cost, not only to those who directly suffer, but also to those tasked with implementing them, and to the moral fabric of the society that sanctions them. Despite the constraints on their choices, some torturers found ways to exercise limited moral agency within their role. Historical records describe executioners who argued for mercy in certain cases, torturers who adjusted techniques to minimize suffering, and officials who bent rules to allow condemned prisoners more dignity than regulations permitted. These small acts of humanity within an inhumane system reveal the persistence of moral intuition, even in contexts designed to suppress it. They suggest that institutional determination is never complete, that individuals retain some capacity for moral judgment, even when operating within systems that discourage it. For contemporary readers, these historical examples of limited resistance offer both hope and challenge. They demonstrate that moral agency can persist even within highly constrained circumstances, while also raising questions about our own responsibilities within modern systems that distribute harm. If medieval torturers could find small ways to mitigate suffering despite their vulnerable position, what moral obligations might fall on those with greater security and power in current institutional contexts? The medieval torturer has long served as a convenient symbol of a supposedly barbaric past, a dark figure whose cruelty allows modern observers to congratulate themselves on moral progress. This simplistic view not only misrepresents historical reality, but also prevents us from recognizing the torturer's relevance to contemporary ethical challenges. By recovering these figures as complex historical subjects, neither demons nor mere victims of circumstance, we gain insight into the human capacity to normalize violence when it is sanctioned by authority and justified by necessity. The torturer's burden becomes not just a historical curiosity, but a case study in how ordinary individuals navigate extraordinary moral compromise. The most valuable lesson these shadowy figures offer may be the recognition that cruelty rarely depends on exceptional monstrosity. Systems that enable and require suffering typically operate not through the actions of inherently evil individuals, but through institutional arrangements that transform violence from criminal act to civic duty, distributing responsibility in ways that allow ordinary people to participate in extraordinary harm. In this recognition lies both warning and hope. warning about how easily institutions can normalize cruelty, and hope in the persistent human capacity for moral reflection, even within systems designed to suppress it. The medieval torturer, properly understood, speaks not only to a distant past, but to enduring questions about institutional power, moral responsibility, and the human struggle to maintain humanity in inhumane contexts.